Good morning, everyone.
All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I see people are making their way into the Zoom call. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and welcome again to our ongoing Zoom series, where we talk to various movers and shakers in the movement for justice in Palestine. My name, again, is Omar Kurdi. I'm with Orange County for Justice in Palestine. Assisting me today in moderating this conversation is going to be Shaymat. Shaymat, can you wave at everybody so we can see you?
Sorry.
Thanks, Shaymat, for helping out and joining today. As a reminder, as always, please like and follow us across our various social media channels. We'll drop some links in the chat box so that you can follow along for any activities or events, programs that we're planning and organizing in the coming weeks and months. Today, we are very honored to be talking to Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee for President of the United States. Thank you, Dr. Stein, for joining us.
Our honor to be here. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Just as a brief introduction, Dr. Stein was born and raised in Chicago. She attended Harvard for both her undergraduate and medical school, if I'm remembering this correctly. Practicing physician for nearly 25 years in the Boston area. First ran for elected office in 2002 for the governor of Massachusetts. She ran in 2016, and she is the current nominee for the, as I mentioned, for the Green Party for this year for 2024. Dr. Stein, I wanted to ask you if you could start by talking about your upbringing. I know you grew up in a Reformed Jewish family, in a Jewish neighborhood, or you were very active in a Jewish community in Chicago. Can you talk about that experience and sort of how that affected or how that impacted your political outlook?
Definitely. And thank you for asking. And again, thank you so much for hosting this really important, timely conversation, as we've seen with the latest news last night about the passage of this. Basically, it's a child starvation bill, essentially, that was, unanimously voted for. We'll perhaps get to that later, but I think it so underscores the urgency of this conversation, and makes me so grateful for the very principled resistance that the Muslim American community is leading. So I really thank you on behalf of all of us. And this relates to my upbringing because I was raised in a Reform Jewish synagogue in a Jewish suburb of Chicago shortly after the Holocaust. And my own grandparents were refugees who had fled pogroms prior to the Holocaust. So at the time I was growing up, the response to the Holocaust and our personal responsibility, everyone's personal responsibility, but especially as Jews, the responsibility that we were taught that we all have as Jews and all of us as humans, really, to ensure that genocide never happens again, not to anyone. And that's what I was taught. And I grew up, going to what we called Sunday school every week, really, until I was about 15 and I was confirmed, which is what the Reform Jews do. I was taught that, do justice, love mercy, and that amounts to being holy, unto your God, doing justice. And the epitome of that is standing up against genocide and human rights violations. So I became active in this campaign, and you may know that we were filling a vacancy that we didn't expect. And so we mobilized rather quickly to be sure that we were not going to lose our ballot lines, which are very difficult to achieve and which, I and others had worked for decades really to achieve. So at any rate, I was so grateful to be able to use the platform and the megaphone of this election to stand up specifically and fight the ongoing genocide that the U.S. is in a full partnership with. I can say more about my upbringing if you like. I'll just say that I had the best of of my generation. I was in a solidly middle-class family going to a public school that had all the advantages of that post-war era, which was one of great prosperity in a community that paid a lot of attention to the upbringing of their kids. And, for me, this is about paying back to society the gifts that I was given as a young person growing up after the Second World War.
And just as a follow-up on that, in many of the protests and rallies that we go to, at the front lines are so many young Jewish Americans who are really leading the charge as far as trying to bring an end to this genocide and to bring about a lasting peace. Um, as a young person in Chicago growing up in that community, what was the sentiment like towards Israel? It seems like there's been a real shift in attitudes amongst at least younger Jews in America. Was it in the community you grew up in? Was it very staunchly pro-Israel? I mean, we're talking, you know, there was at least at a point in time where Israel was regarded as a liberal vanguard amongst many people. So I can see how opinions may have changed. What was it like in your experience?
My grandfather actually was named Israel, before Israel was created, but, he had enormous identification with Israel. And in the community and in my family, Israel was a very big deal. And for reasons I'm not altogether sure I understand, I never went to Israel. We were all supposed to go there and become a part of that tradition. And for some reason, I found myself not wanting to do that. There was something about about the way Zionism was taught to us that just raised questions in my mind. I didn't know really any specifics about what was going on in Palestine, but I sort of felt like we were being railroaded into something that raised questions in my mind. So I was, I believe, the only member of my family that refused to actually go to Israel. I do have to say, though, that my older sister, who was an educator, was very tuned in to the movement within kind of the progressive education movement to connect with the struggle in Palestine. And so I did have kind of within my own family that had started off quite Zionist, there were others who were breaking away from that tradition long before me. And this was going back, I think, even into, I would say, the 1970s, actually.
Wow,
Wow.
very early on.
Yeah.
And can I ask you, so one of the issues that we sort of confront often is that, say you have a neighbor or a friend or a coworker who, they're sort of torn on the issue, so to speak, that they have this nostalgic view of Israel, that they have a family connection to Israel, that it's the Jewish homeland, that type of thing. But on the other hand, they see all that's happening and they can't reconcile the two. I mean, how would you, as somebody who's trying to win somebody over or explain the issue to them, or to help them better understand the issue, do you have any ideas or strategies, or what would you recommend to that person to try to explain or to help win somebody over in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, and this conversation is happening all the time. I think as people of Jewish background, and I'm actually not a practicing Jew. I haven't been for decades, actually. So I don't have that much like intensive contact with the Jewish community. But, certainly the progressive community is full of people of Jewish background. So we are having these conversations all the time and sharing, those of us who are strongly anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian, we are constantly sort of, sharing with each other, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the resistance in your own family? And, I would just say that it is all about education. It is all about trying to share the facts with people, and the facts are so overwhelming. Um, you know, I I try to be strategic about who I talk to and when, because the conversation provokes so much pushback. You have to be careful. And I find myself very focused on the persuadables as opposed to those who are dug in.
Mhm.
But so many people right now are persuadable and they are asking questions. And when we as a campaign have contact with communities that are not fundamentally mobilizing around this, but they're mobilizing around something else, like East Palestine, the site of this horrific railway spill. We were there recently, this is deep red country. And the issue, I mean, we brought this issue up and found there was enormous sympathy. And one of the things that I always try to do as a medical doctor is to clarify for people how it is that this impacts us. And this does impact everyone. The position that Israel and the US are taking is making us both pariahs in the community of nations. It's also incredibly expensive. This is impoverishing us. It's what is it, 17 billion that's on the table right now, in addition to 3.8 billion that got appropriated last night and every year. But it's part of a broader imperial approach to foreign policy, a militaristic approach to foreign policy, which is extremely destructive, wrong-headed, is getting us into trouble. We are losing these wars one after the other. And I really do try to clarify for people how Gaza is the tip of the iceberg, and that what happens in Gaza doesn't stay in Gaza. As Gaza goes, we all go. And that if we allow the torture and murder of children to be normalized in Gaza, we're basically normalizing this for our future. So this is just a violation of our basic humanity and our, essential human rights and international law. All of that is at risk right now. And I try to clarify also to people that the US has been top dog here for decades, for the better part of a century, really. We have been top dog. But that's not going to last. I mean, we have already lost our position of economic predominance. That's looking at the US and our allies in NATO versus the BRICS alliance, sort of the global South. And they're winning the day. They are a rising power. We are a declining power that has been in decline for some time. So for the sake of our own, security, it's very important that we be in the business now of shoring up international law and not tearing it down. So for many people, I find that is a helpful approach to clarify for people how much we are all at risk. And the other issue that I try to bring in is that of nuclear war, because the US is now bombing 4 countries and Iranian targets, not Iran itself yet, but we are certainly giving Iran reason to be, quite mobilized against us. And Iran is now in a military alliance with Russia, which brings the potential for nuclear confrontation. That is a clear and present danger that we all need to be mindful of. And in the age of nuclear weapons, there is no such thing as a localized nuclear exchange. Nuclear explosions are so powerful that they drive debris up into the upper atmosphere where it doesn't settle out for decades, actually, and it devastates agricultural production. And just one nuclear-armed submarine contains the equivalent of 4,000 Hiroshima bombs, which is more than enough to put us into very substantial nuclear winter and basically wipe out, maybe it's half, maybe it's more of the global population. So nuclear weapons are something we all need to be mindful of. We all need to abolish, and we all need to avoid the circumstances that could trigger their use. So, essentially that's kind of the approach that I use. And I also point out, by the way, that this is devastating to Israel, that this is essentially poisoning Israel's relationships with its neighbors, and it will be overwhelmed. At the end of the day, nothing is going to protect Israel if its neighbors are really mobilized against it. So getting people to understand how we are all in the crosshairs of this conflict together, and we all have to insist that it gets solved, uh, immediately in terms of stopping the genocide and then crafting a broader solution that is that upholds international law, and that means no apartheid, no occupation, and no ethnic cleansing.
And it sounds like such a far removed threat, the idea of nuclear war, but the bulletin atomic scientist has us, I think we're as close to midnight as we've ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. So it's not some far removed threat at all. It's as dangerous as it's ever been.
And if you
Um,
compare our situation now to that of pre-World War I, when, it was like a quagmire in which, it just took a little match to really trigger a global war. We could be there. So this is like pre-World War I, but with nuclear weapons thrown into the mix. So there's every reason here. I think it's actually criminal negligence on the part of our leaders to be embroiling us into this conflict, in addition to the war crimes that they are committing. I think this is also criminal negligence on the part of our leadership.
Absolutely. And it goes to the bigger point, I think, is that this policy, this line of policy, does serve the interests of ordinary Americans. This only serves the interests of a handful of big defense contractors, big oil, and special interest groups, Christian Zionists in the South, across the Bible Belt, some other interests, but the average American is not benefited by this policy in the slightest.
Exactly.
Um,
We are
I
all
want to turn
very
it over
much
to.
endangered. I was
I
just
want to
going to
turn it over to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to summarize that to say, this is what we commonly say, that we are being impoverished and we are being endangered. Exactly, as you say.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn it
All
over to
right.
Shema. Shema has a line of questions for you, so go ahead, Shema.
All right, thanks, Summer. So, Dr. Stein, you ran in 2016, and some people in the Democratic Party kind of were like, "Oh, you're the reason we have Trump. People who voted for you would have voted for Hillary and stuff like that." You were kind of they were trying to scapegoat you into you're the one responsible for Trump rather than addressing the actual problems. So what do you say to that? And what did you learn from that experience? Because it seems like we are heading for a Trump presidency again, and DNC will never. It doesn't look like they're going to acknowledge the actual problem. So how was your experience back then, and what did you learn? So you're prepared for this time around.
Yes. And, that smear campaign has not let up. And actually, the smear campaign long preceded the 2016 election. And, the powers that be go to great lengths to try to fear campaign and smear campaign to obliterate their opposition. And in fact, this strategy goes all the way back, at least to the Civil War, when the parties of abolition, the parties that first formed to try to dismantle the criminal institution of slavery, they too were characterized as so-called spoilers. So this is this is like a sort of a sign of the desperation of power holders as they begin to feel their grip slip. So there are all kinds of arguments. We have one. Well, we actually have several videos that speak to this concisely, and we can send you links to those as well because our supporters find them very helpful. But one of the arguments is that this is an extremely anti-democratic notion that we do not have freedom of choice in our elections, and we try to remind people that anyone who suggests that they own your vote, that they don't have to earn your vote, but they own it and they're entitled to your vote, they should be disqualified from consideration of your vote, at the outset. So we try to really make that firm connection that this is a violation of basic democratic tenets. And we remind people that our power, our political power of democracy relies on free choice. It relies on compelling our elected representatives to represent us. And if we don't stand up and vote for the positions that we take, we're essentially giving away our political power and the foundation of how democracy is supposed to work. If I have time, when this conversation occurs, I try to explain one quick example, which really speaks volumes. The most spoiled elections from the point of view of the stranglehold of the Democratic Party on our political process. The most spoiled election ever was 2010, the midterms. What happened then was that the Democrats lost 1,000 state legislative seats. They lost 64 seats in Congress. They lost 12 Senate seats and 13 governor seats. So this was a huge wipeout. There was no third party to blame this on. What happened? This was the midterms following the Wall Street bailouts, where, trillions was made available to the crooks who crashed the economy because of their waste, fraud, and abuse, basically, at the expense, among other things, of some 8 million families who were thrown out of their homes. And that was on top of NAFTA and the loss of millions of jobs, largely on the part of the Democrats. So this was about working people beginning to break the stranglehold of the Democratic Party. It's not that people were for the Republican agenda. They were just mobilized against the Democrats. And that has remained, a consistent theme since then. And we try to point out to people that that's the driver here, and what the Democrats are doing by trying to blame us, third parties or Greens or myself, what they're trying to do is, as you said, basically scapegoat us. And there's one other argument we bring up, which is that the polls make very clear that people who come out to vote, third party or Green in particular, are not Democrats. They are people who otherwise won't be voting. And as we saw in Michigan in the recent primary, not only, 13, 14% who were, so-called uncommitted, that is against Biden, but you had half of the turnout for that primary Democratic election, which tells you that the Democrats have really lost their base in this election. So that's the largest group of voters, are the uncommitted, non-voting electorate. The non-voting electorate deserves to have choices, and it's just preposterous to suggest that they don't.
Yeah, actually, and they also try to bully us, like the Muslim community. They're like, oh, you're gonna get thrown the Muslim ban. What are you doing? I'm like, well, that's not really our problem. You should have someone better than Biden. Yeah. So another thing that I would like you to discuss with us, a lot of people in our community is hoping that you would have a united ticket with Dr. West. And I came to the understanding that there's been a fallout. And that is kind of may not be in the picture. So Dr. West have already talked about it, but I would like to know your take on this, because I know this is a question in the minds of many.
Sure. And we are open to collaboration and have, publicly invited collaboration with Dr. West and potentially with other candidates as well. In particular, Claudia de la Cruz with the Party of Socialism and Liberation. And we've invited small collaborations and large collaborations and exploring a potential run. Now, in Dr. West's defense, I want to say that when I first was tricked into running for office for the first time, I didn't have a clue how to work with the party. And it took me actually many runs to learn how to do that. It can be quite overwhelming to be faced with a whole team of people that's used to working together, and you're not used to working with them. And, in his defense, he has never worked with a political party. He has never run for office. It's very, very hard to learn how to do that. It takes an awful lot of trust and history and relationship building to run for office with a party, especially an office like the president. So when we offered our ballot line, to Dr. West, which we can't technically offer, but, many of us in the heart of the Green Party offered to work for that, and to win that ballot line through the Greens. And I should say, I don't yet have that nomination formally. We are very close right now to getting the delegates. We've been winning every one of the primaries so far, the primaries or the conferences. We have won with about a 90% margin. So we're quite confident we are going to have that nomination, but technically it doesn't belong to anybody. You have to win it. But we offered to work very hard. And in fact, we went to work very hard as volunteers for months. Just about 24/7, like sacrificing family vacations and everything in order to give his campaign a real fighting chance. And then, some differences in strategy and hiring and things like that. I was technically supposed to be the campaign manager initially, and I operated as I understood campaign managers to operate, which is to, weigh in. We're not supposed to be yes men. We're supposed to weigh in based on our experience and our judgment. And some of my opinions about how the campaign should be managed did not match with Dr. West's and his family. And, he's a very family and community person. And, I'm used to running a campaign that will succeed, and is consistent with our principles and our vision and our aspirations. And so that basis for decision-making was not really shared. So I stepped back from that position. And then meanwhile, we had recruited the best of the Green Party to be there. And many of them are still serving his campaign. But many in his staff have stepped away. I was surprised to learn that he had decided he was going to run independent without ever having raised an issue or brought it up for discussion. So it was quite a surprise to me. And I learned just before it was announced that that decision had been made. It was over and done with. And to me, it felt that was unfortunate that we were not able to use that as an opportunity to do some problem solving as a team. And, but he has been a powerful solo voice. And that is, I think that's just his comfort zone, is to be a powerful solo voice. And he found, when you're working with a party, it's like working with any organization, people are working for you. So they will make demands of you and they want to know your policy positions and you're going to have a debate about them. And, that's just how political organizations work, as I'm sure you know. And, and that was not his comfort zone. It's not how he wanted to be using his time and energy. So you make a leap of faith. It's a question mark whenever a party works with a candidate that they haven't worked with before, it's always a question mark in everyone's mind. So, it was not like a total shock when it didn't work out. And we were glad that we helped keep his voice in the race and his powerful moral vision, front and center in the dialogue. And when he went his own way, we expressed our desire that maybe we could find a way to collaborate. And he was not interested, I think, for the same reason that it's just his comfort zone to be the solo voice, the powerful solo voice that he's always been. But we are still exploring this opportunity with others who feel like, this is such a critical moment. It's really important for the left or, progressives, however you want to describe that, people-powered politics. It's really important for us to overcome now our small divisions and for us to collaborate in as big a way as possible. And we are actively pursuing that. In fact, some of the members of our team right now are participating in a conference today of one of those small progressive political parties that is also, part of this exploration. So we are very engaged in this.
That is great to know that you're still open. I mean, that's amazing. Team spirit. I mean, you have to be able to work in a team if you want to run to be a president, right? Like you don't roll alone. I'm gonna hand it over to Omar. Thanks,
Great
Omar.
talking with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
On the topic of political parties, I guess sometimes it gets missed that in our system, the democratic process really favors the two established parties. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges of running as a third party candidate, from just getting on the ballot, just ballot access, and some of the let's say, tricks or hurdles that are thrown your way in terms of getting on the ballot?
So the powers that be have a whole set of roadblocks to competition, and competition is what democracy is supposed to be about. It's not about being given marching orders from those who hold power. So we regard this as really essential to our vision as Greens to reform this. We have a whole set of reforms which are front and center. One of them you may have heard about, called ranked choice voting, that allows people to rank their choices instead of just picking one. And if your first choice loses the election, to explain in a somewhat oversimplified way, but basically your first choice, if it loses, is then reassigned to your second choice. So you never have to feel like you're voting for an underdog and your vote could be, quote, thrown away. And you also never have to worry that you are splitting the vote, because you're never splitting the vote. So all of those things that drive a politics of fear can be removed. They can be put to an end. And the Greens actually put this on the map a couple decades ago. It's now been adopted by the state of Maine. It's on the ballot as a referendum for several additional states. This November, it's been adopted by about 25 cities and so on. So that's one of the things. It's that politics of fear, which I think is the biggest impediment of all. But there are many others, like the obstructions to getting on the ballot. Democrats and Republicans are basically grandfathered in because they are established parties. They get a lot of votes, so they automatically exceed the criteria. They don't have to go out and collect what amounts to essentially 1 million signatures if you add them up all together. And we have to do that and spend a lot of time, money, and energy just focused on that. And I will say we're doing very well. We have about 75% of that work done, and we can come back to that as its own issue. That's one of the issues. The debates, such as they exist, debates have kind of been wiped out. It's not clear that they're going to happen this time around at all. And there are alternative debates that are being held. One group is called Free and Equal. They've held their first multi-partisan debate, which is actually very interesting because it gets us talking across party lines and really debating basic principles of our different visions and strategy and so on. Money in politics, is maybe the biggest one, but we've gotten so accustomed to it. We don't, you don't hear it called out often, but it was something like $7 billion that was spent in the 2016 election cycle, and it was more than double that in the next one. And you have all of these workarounds that allow the guardrails to keep money from all out buying our elections. Those guardrails, they get worked around all the time now by the big parties, not only through super PACs, which allow unlimited contributions of unlimited size, through dark money, through things called victory funds that we never hear very much about, but it allows a single donor to write one check for $600,000. And that money will go through various levels of party committee and will wind up in the hands of the presidential campaign together with the DNC to collaborate. From one person, so our system gives enormous power to those who have enormous resources. And this is why the American public feels that our political system has been bought and our political parties are basically bought and paid for. And this is one of the drivers of the fact that public opinion has almost no relationship to the congressional agenda. And this is true at the state level too. The priorities for legislation at state and national level are really decided by the biggest campaign contributions and the lobbyists, which explains a lot why that bill got passed unanimously by Democrats last night in the Senate. It was a unanimous vote for this child starvation bill. It was just staggering at a time that the American public is vehemently opposed to that. There are other things in this bill, but the fact that it was used to, as a Trojan horse, really, to drive through this horrific genocidal set of policies, including, defunding UNWRA and the hope of alleviating this mass starvation, which is exploding now before our very eyes. It's just jaw-dropping and staggering, and I think, really is cause to just double down and move as fast as we can to remove from power these human rights abusers, these genociders, and there they are. They're in Congress as well as in the White House, and we need as broad a challenge as possible. Those are some of the key impediments. But what we do have going for us, and having run now, this is my third run, I can say this is so different because we were ahead of the curve in the last two races. We were very ahead of the curve, not only in our human rights and economic agenda domestically, but internationally, and in terms of our foreign policy, that we have long called for a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy. Excuse me, not on brute military and economic power. We've called for, cutting the military budget at least by half, which will still leave us far ahead of every other, military budget world over. We're currently spending the equivalent of the next 10 biggest spenders. But, we have also called for basically, a boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is what we need now, I think, on an international level. Israel needs to be treated like the pariah state that it is, and the U.S. too, if we don't back off. But we very much need to get on the right side of history here.
There's so much to unpack there. I want to come back to the UNRWA vote from last night, but I did want to comment on what you had raised about the issue of money in politics. There's so much coverage and discussion about foreign interference in our elections and these conspiracy theories about these Russian bots that won over the election for Hillary Clinton, but next to no coverage about the fact that this billionaire class and these big corporations, basically the average American is probably right about this, the elections are bought and sold between this duopoly of the two big parties. And rather than reflect on this and ask the Democratic leadership, asking themselves, what is it that we're doing that we've lost an entire swath of the country that refuse to even participate in the process? They instead resort to conspiracy theories. They blame people like you. They blame the voter because they don't turn up. And we all know the reason the voters don't turn up is because the voters figured out it doesn't matter if I show up and vote or not. The decisions are all made by a small group of elites, and my vote effectively doesn't matter. So part of the problem, I think, is how do we break out of that constraint? Because these parties don't have any interest in undoing the system. It was built to benefit them. Why would they do anything other than enable the existing system?
Yeah, exactly. And in response to that, I want to just quote two people whose guidance I find very helpful. One is Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. We don't know when this system is going to open up, but we know that it's absolutely unsustainable, that public opinion has been lost. It's in the Declaration of Independence that all just power derives from consent of the governed. The governed no longer consent. If you look at public confidence in any of our institutions, it's absolutely in the tank right now. So it's no wonder that we are so readily divided and pitted against each other, because there is no glue right now. There's no kind of confidence in who we are as as a democracy, and there's very little democracy to speak of here. So the system is broken, and it's just a question of when we hit the tipping point and then which way we are going to tip, which, as all of us, I think, realize, democracy is not a spectator sport. We have to be in it. We have to be engaged, and we can't just vote against what we don't want. That doesn't give democracy an explicit agenda or instructions. Elected officials need to be instructed with an explicit agenda. So uncommitted is a wonderful starting point, but the sooner we can move from uncommitted to committed and what we are committed for and who we are committed with, that's where we have to go. And, you know, so I find Frederick Douglass's guidance very helpful. We need to make that demand because the public is listening. In my experience, we've never had the kind of interest and attention, especially this early in the campaign, that we have right now. And what we are seeing out there, we just got back from like a 21, 23 city tour. In like 3 weeks, we went a lot of places, talked to a lot of people. The biggest driver out there is genocide, and people are horrified by what they see. And it's across the age spectrum, and people are really impassioned right now. So I think, you know, we not only have an opportunity, we have a responsibility to ourselves and to humanity to use this moment and to bring everything that we can bear to this moment, because the tip is going to happen. You know, in my experience, starting out as a very obscure political party in 2012, we were, you know, not known. And over the years, we have become known as a as really a vehicle for humanized resistance, you know, for political dissent on behalf of a human rights agenda and a peace agenda. We've kind of established that. And how did we do it? You know, it's like you're climbing up the rock face and you're not sure what your path is, but you're looking for one little crevice after another, you know, to stick your hand in here and your foot there. And you're just kind of doing what you have to do to work with history as it unfolds, knowing that, as Martin Luther King said, you know, the arc of justice, of the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So we are just looking for those openings, election by election. And in this one, it's the biggest, you know, the imperative for urgent change, immediate change has never been so immediate and urgent and like an emergency. And the possibility for harnessing that impulse to actually achieve that change has never been so big. Let me throw out one thing that I find really interesting. So the press at this point doesn't really understand the realities of ballot access. They don't understand why it is that we really are the one campaign that is on track right now with an anti-genocide, anti-war, pro-worker, climate emergency agenda. There are several such candidates out there, but we are the one that actually knows how to get on the ballot. We've gotten on the ballot for 97% of voters in 2016, and we are in the process of doing that right now. In fact, we are well on our way. So we are going to, and the others are not really progressing in any major way and do not have the resources and the grassroots network and so on. You don't do this on your first try. As a rule, it takes a while of learning how to do this. So the other campaigns are really not showing signs that they are on track to be challenging empire in all 50 states. And, you know, to really be a realistic option as opposed to a compelling moral voice. That's one thing, but we actually want to see that change happen. We want to see not one more bullet, not one more dollar in this genocide. So the press doesn't understand, you know, and they're always talking about, you know, all this competition. But among this competition, we are really the one elephant in the room, I have to say, that is has done it before, knows how to do it, and is well on the way on track to doing that. There will be one such progressive campaign. It's highly likely. On the other hand, there are going to be 4 genocidal campaigns, 4 major genocidal campaigns: Biden, Trump, No Labels, and RFK. They are going to be splitting the genocide vote 4 ways. There will be one unifying humanitarian vote. So that kind of election can be won when there's a 5-way competition. In theory, that could be won with as little as 22% of the vote. Not that that will necessarily go that way, but that is a possibility. And it's important for people to know that this is actually winnable. It's not just that we can establish a real foundation for an ongoing struggle for a world we can all live in, a world that respects decency, human rights, and international law. That is a real possibility that we could not only establish an ongoing base of operations that continues to build at the local, state, and national level, but that there actually is the potential for a black swan event in this election more than any other.
And
Yeah.
you know, there's so much that can happen between now and November. I mean, there's so much talk about will Biden even be the nominee? You know, you could see Gavin Newsom clearly is actively campaigning. He has been. So who knows, really? So I think Professor Finkelstein even said something to this effect that you never say never. I mean, all the cards are on the table. There's so many different possibilities and outcomes. I know we have to get to the questions in the comment section. I just wanted to ask you one additional one.
Sure.
So many of the folks that I talk to that I'm talking about, you got to vote for Dr. Jill Stein. You got to, and then the response is frequently, look, I love everything she says. I love everything she says. I agree with every single issue she has. But ultimately, I have to live in the world as it is, not in the world as I want it to be. If I vote, and maybe California is a little bit different, but if I live in Michigan or Pennsylvania or one of these swing states, I'm risking a situation where I end up with a scenario like Trump in power. And I take your point that we just have to vote against the worst of the two evils. But as far as a strategy goes, what is the strategy to try to, what is the strategy? Is the strategy to try to prevail in November, or is it to try to basically end up in a kingmaker role? Where are you headed with your campaign?
In my view, the strategy is to win. And whether we win by winning the White House or we win by winning the day and establishing a strong political force for peace and justice writ very broadly, either of those is a win. You can, most of the time, in order to get to 51%, you want to first get to 5%, and then you want to get to 25%, and so on. That's the way it usually works, but not always. I think however it works, it's a win. I also reject the presumption that Trump is the fascist threat and that Biden is not. If you look at the bill that passed last night, more supported by Democrats than Republicans, it's an utterly, draconian, authoritarian, fascist bill. If you look at what is in that bill, from prohibiting the funding of UNRWA, it's a genocidal bill, for one. What greater trademark of fascism is there than genocide? And Trump, while he's, horrific, he was the one president who didn't start a new war. He really talks big, but he doesn't always do what he says. And I totally reject the Democrats' interpretation of his statements and his actions. They are really quite off the wall in how they are, trying to combat him. And there's just incredible propaganda and fear-mongering going on there. And, I generally take the view that the politics of fear has brought us everything we're afraid of. All the reasons we've been told to, vote for the lesser evil because we didn't want endless war, we didn't want the bashing of immigrants, we didn't want climate disaster, and climate policies are something that I could go into in great length to clarify how Biden is really the greatest threat right now to the climate based on these 22 liquid natural gas export facilities that he has approved and is pushing forward. They're all deadly. Both of these campaigns and both of these parties are lethal. They have proven that over and over again. I think if there's to be any hope for our surviving, and particularly for our children to survive into the next decade, let alone the next century, we have to stand up for what's right. And we are the ones we've been waiting for. If we don't do it, who is, who will do this? We have to do this. It's our responsibility. No pressure, but this is our responsibility. We are choosing what kind of a world we're going to have.
Absolutely. I think we really are at a turning point here. So things are coming to a head. So I think like you said, more than ever, this really is our responsibility, our obligation. Shema is going to ask you some questions from the chat box. So Shema, take it away.
Yeah. So Dr. Stein, so like we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to combine as much as I can.
Okay.
And maybe like you can give them like a
I'll
quick
try to do
yeah.
a rapid fire round here, and I'll be
Yeah,
short.
exactly. Let's make it a fire. So somebody is asking, like, we've been protesting and calling the reps for months, and like they still passed this horrific bill. Especially like people like AOC, for example, and Katie Porter, who are like, oh, they speak the right words, but then they go ahead and just vote against everything they've said. Um, what can we like people are feeling like kind of apathy now and that nothing is working, so what can we do basically?
I'll just say courage is contagious, and people will collapse into apathy when they don't see and hear something that's inspirational. The Democrats are where progressive policies go to die because they dumb them down, they complicate them, they ensure that they will not move forward. Our job is to break the sound barrier, to be heard and seen, and to develop a collaborative strategy that helps to harness several networks here that are sizable and that are resisting, power as usual. And I would include not only the anti-genocide community, the college campuses, which are also on fire about student debt, the Medicare for All, the healthcare justice community. You start putting those groups together, the medical debt community, as well as the student debt community. 100 million people are in medical debt. You start systematic outreach to these various groups, and you can get to huge numbers quickly. That's our strategy, and that's our job. The others, it's like, if you build it, they will come. We got to build it.
That's a great idea, actually, like reach for like common causes, not just Palestine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All right. So what are your thoughts on the current process of how bills are passed through the Congress and Senate, and do you have any plans to reform this process, because it seems very flawed?
Absolutely. So number one, and this could be done rather quickly, is to close the revolving door between big special interests and our regulatory boards, for example, EPA, FDA, et cetera, the FAA with all of the troubles around Boeing and Boeing's influence. And then you have opioids and the Sackler family and their influence in the FDA, so that's certainly a major part of what's driving the loss of confidence in government and in our institutions. We need to close the revolving door so that either you're working for industry or you're working in the public interest. You can't move back and forth from one to the other, which is what they do. And then we need to get money out of politics. And that is a little more complicated. There are various approaches to that, but there are big steps that we can take to help shut down the power of money to buy our political system. And then there's also the bully pulpit. The president has enormous power, as do other, electeds, and we have many congressional candidates now too who are terrific and operating on the same agenda. So we need to be helping to drive the vision here to identify the corruption, to call it out, like AIPAC, like the power of the weapons industry to dictate bills. We need to be calling it out. We need to be helping to drive votes and to drive the pressure that local communities can assert on their elected officials who need to represent them. And by insisting that elected officials be holding town hall meetings, which they don't do now, they used to do all the time, to actually hear from their constituents instead of just the lobbyists, we can really begin to change the dynamics even before we have changed the laws themselves.
They try to shut us down actually now.
They
Like they
absolutely
want to,
do.
like they don't want to hear it.
They don't. Yeah, no, absolutely not, which tells you how vulnerable they are. And if the president were calling them out for that and, and setting an example with public hearings, we need to have public hearings in Congress. I mean, the there's so much the president can do with the bully pulpit, and we will not get elected without a strong grassroots movement. So the name of the game is then continuing that strong grassroots movement. That will be required for everything that happens. And we're putting everyone on notice, who's working for the campaign, that election day is not the end of your job. Election day would be the beginning of your job. If we are so fortunate as to turn the White House into a greenhouse, which is what we want to do, then we're all on the job here for the next 4 years.
Absolutely. And you cannot be talking and championing environment when you are allowing thousands of bombs to be dropped. Because, like, I mean, are we talking about the environmental impact of all of these weapons, or are they like not affecting them? Like, it seems silly, like ridiculous, honestly. All right,
Agree.
so yeah, the last question we have is, and like we can stay a couple minutes more, maybe because we
Sure.
started a bit late.
Okay. Yeah.
So when do we start talking about solutions to what's happening in Palestine? Like we feel like all of the problems that are happening right now are connected, and honestly, like the carte blanche that Israel has to do whatever they want, it's kind of spilling into problems in other places like India and like other places.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what are practical solutions that we can do um like to deal with this?
Yeah. And, there is an overarching solution here, which is called international law. And because,
Yeah.
what Israel is doing is violating international law. The US is violating its own laws right now by funding Israel, which is undeniably interfering with the distribution of humanitarian aid. So there's very strong reason to shut this down. That is step one. Immediately, we need to shut down the genocide right now. We are trying to educate as we go to clarify that the genocide goes hand in hand with ethnic cleansing and apartheid and occupation, and that has to be set right. And it's not too soon to discuss that. Zionism is not consistent with international law. And we need to approach this, with assurances that this is about everyone's security and clarification that this is extremely dangerous for Israel now to allow this genocide to go forward as well. So, there needs to be a bigger picture here as we shut down the genocide, but the goal is compliance with international law. And, it's a question of how much you can advance that conversation at any one time. But the first goal obviously is to stop the genocide. The larger issue here really is one of empire, I think, empire and international law, because Gaza is just the tip of the iceberg, and Israel, as discussed by Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan, who named Israel as the unsinkable battleship for the US in the Middle East. What was that about? That was about controlling the oil supply, which we needed back then. We don't need anymore. We're the major exporter of fossil fuels, but the US is determined to control the oil supply for the world, which is why we want this jumping off point for military intervention in the Middle East. This is not tenable. And there's a lot of, education that needs to be done around this, but the US is no longer the monopolar power in the world. We're in a multipolar world, and we have a lot of conflict going on right now. According to the Brown University Cost of War project, the US has active so-called anti-terror operations now going on in 85 countries. 85 countries.
Wow.
In addition to, some 800 bases. We're spending half of our congressional budget. There are so many ways that this kind of imperial approach to foreign policy is not working. We need a broad and comprehensive set of reforms here and a lot of public discussion. But I think the American public shares the basic point of view here, both about genocide, but also about American empire, that it is impoverishing us and it is endangering us. And, international law is kind of at the end of the day how we have to move forward here.
Dr. Stein, we have more questions, so I was wondering if you have time to go a bit overtime.
Sure. Yes. And no, absolutely. I'm
Oh,
good.
okay. So somebody is saying, like is asking, like they voted for you instead of Hillary. I know actually two people. So like in this chat, so like they voted for you in 2016, but they're wondering if like when will a third party actually be winning, or is this a long game? We're in it for the long run. Like, what's your opinion?
My opinion is that that is the $24,000 question. You don't know. You don't know when things are going to change. And if I can quote Chris Hedges here, or, describe what he says, he was reporting in East Germany, I think. I believe he was in East Berlin before the wall came down, and there was a kind of democratic resistance to the Stasi, the secret police that were spying on people. And, there was a very abusive, heavy hand of a militarized police force in East Berlin. And this would be going back to, I think, the late 80s. Yeah, this was probably like the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. But he said that the conventional wisdom was, and they were holding weekly demonstrations that were getting bigger and bigger. And the common knowledge among the proponents of democracy was that, oh, maybe in a couple of years, we'll reach critical mass. But then, like, within 2 weeks, the wall came down because suddenly there was just a trigger and people turned out in huge numbers. And basically, the East German government stepped aside. And you don't know when these unusual, kind of unpredictable events are going to happen. And likewise, if you look at the history of deep change, historically, whether it was like the abolition of slavery in the United States, the labor movement, the passage of child labor laws, the 40-hour work week, it took a social movement and it took a political movement together to actually force the hand of oppressive power. And that seems to be the usual magical combination. And, to me, that's always been sort of like the goal. Just leave it to history to decide, when that breaking point is. But by all indicators, the American people, and not to mention the people of the world, are past the breaking point now. It's
I
over
think so.
60% of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck. People are really desperate. Over half of renters are severely economically stressed right now, trying to keep a roof over their heads. And we're hearing from Biden how great the economy is. And it's all about Bidenomics. That is, if you're in maybe the top 15%, but they're not speaking to the reality. And the reality is that we're at the breaking point. Our job is not to say when it's going to happen, but just to make it possible to,
Work for it.
yeah, exactly.
Work for it. So just one follow-up question, I think, and it ties to this. Like, what is direct local work that we can get involved in to change other than voting green? And how can we get attraction for the BDS movement?
Exactly. So, city council resolutions are doing pretty well now. And I really encourage people,
We're
you know,
failing in our city.
oh, that's great.
We're
How,
failing. No, but it's
oh, you're
not.
failing? Oh,
We're
okay.
failing
Yeah.
in my city.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And what I would love to see then is people challenging the city councilors. In other words, harness the power of your resolution movement to then field a candidate. Because it's once, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. We have to bring that demand home to them. It needs to have a political dimension. They need to feel the heat. It's unbelievable right now that they're doing what they're doing against the overwhelming sentiment of the American population. So they need to see that the writing is on the wall, that they're out of a job,
Right.
or in the case of Congress and the president, not only are they out of a job, but they're potentially, going before the World Court of Justice, because they are, if you're voting to cut off food to starving people, how is that not, a war crime? I think everyone who voted for this bill should be considered as committing a war crime. So at any rate, that's just to say political challenge needs to go hand in hand, and it can do that at the local level, hand in hand with a policy challenge.
All right. Um, Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a privilege. Gonna hand it over to Omar. He has one more question for you.
Sure.
Actually,
Oh,
I
and
have,
I should add also, supporting ranked choice voting, supporting democracy reforms is also part of the solution. I'd say work on whatever speaks to your heart. And
Yeah,
if we're all engaged, that's a lot of people pushing. Both work for what's in your heart, but at the same time, join hands with those who are working with the allied agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit. Together, we're
absolutely.
unstoppable. Great.
Jason put in
Absolutely.
the chat box to get behind the ranked choice voting movement. Join
Yes.
Fair Vote. I think it's Fair Vote campaign. We'll try to find a link for it and put it in the chat box as well. Make sure you go to jillstein2024.com for more information on Dr. Stein's campaign. I just had, if I could, one or two final questions.
Sure.
This is from Omar B. He's asking about your human rights policy. In 2016, you had made a statement or a comment about working with the government in Syria to, I think it was to fight against ISIS. How does that square away with a human rights first policy, given that the government in Syria has committed horrific human rights atrocities? Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of the war in Syria that the government legitimately bears the primary brunt of responsibility for that. How does that square away?
Yeah, a good question. And I'd say Syria is a very difficult. My cat wants to join. My cat wants to dominate the conversation here, which is why I'm going to keep her out of the camera if I can. He's pretty good at sneaking back in. But yeah, I mean, Syria is a very difficult situation, and the role that the U.S. has played in instigating chaos in Syria is also not clear. And so we have not, I think we took one position on Syria and then we took another. And we have sort of refrained from taking a strong position on Syria since then, mainly because it's quite a challenge to untangle what's going on in Syria. But I would encourage people to listen to and consider Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is head of the Department of Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and has been a observer, like in the midst of that long ongoing crisis. He has been a very close observer, and he is a truth teller in ways that kind of gets him into trouble. But I have found him extremely reliable and provocative as an observer. I think there's no good guy here in the mix. And so it's hard to like take sides. I think the end of the flow of stopping the flow of weapons and demanding a ceasefire and the application of international law. But I can't say more at this point about what it needs. I would just say that it's not it doesn't lend itself to a soundbite in my experience.
I understand. I appreciate that.
And I just want to say, that this is not separate from the many countries throughout the Middle East and around the world where the U.S. has played a horrific role, helping to set parties against each other, funding both sides, encouraging a very violent and horrific terrorist movement. The U.S. has a hand in this, and I find that our first job is to get our own house in order here, so that we're not instigating these conflicts all over the world.
And Jason posted the article by Jeffrey Sachs in the chat box, so please, everybody, be sure to check that out. If we could end this our discussion today, we could talk about yesterday's UNRWA vote. The one thing I wanted to, if I could just start you off with something to work from,
Sure.
Senator Holland, who has been on TV expressing serious, grave concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. He's talking about how there is active famine, starvation happening, if not imminent, if not already happening. He's talking about how UNRWA has nothing to do with Hamas, that UNRWA, the head of UNRWA, is a 20-year United States military veteran. And then yesterday, or last night, he voted yes for the bill to gut UNRWA. How does any of this make sense?
I mean, to me, this is a testament to the dehumanization of our political system, where our elected officials are not representing us. They're not representing basic humanity. They are violating their own, hearts, minds, and souls here. They become robots, really, serving corporate interests, serving special interests, in this case, AIPAC and the war industry. Otherwise, it's just impossible to explain this. And to my mind, this is cause for removal from office. Anyone who is serving AIPAC or any other, campaign donor here and ignoring their own humanity and the desperation of children and the normalization of child torture and murder that's going on. I think those who voted for this bill just signed their confession to being essentially war criminals. And I think it's important, I find, for my own, mental health, not to get terribly wrapped up in trying to explain evil, demonic, anti-democratic things. Our job is to stay focused on how do we remove these criminals from office.
Awesome.
And with that, we'll end it there. Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us. Bringing these folks, getting these folks out of office and getting folks like Dr. Stein in office is really the only way forward. So check out her website, and we'll look for other opportunities to help support her campaign. Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us today. You're a breath of fresh air. We wish you the best of luck on the trail. And if there's anything that we can do to help support you and your campaign, please reach out and we will be happy to work with you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I so appreciate this opportunity to share our higher visions, and we are very inspired by what you in particular and the larger Muslim American community is doing to really raise the bar for democracy and human rights for all of us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stein, and definitely we'll be in touch to organize more stuff on the groundwork to support your campaign.
Awesome. Okay, very exciting. I look forward to that. Thank you, Shema.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.